Julian Cross had never once, in 41 years, cried in front of another human being. Not when his mother died. Not when his marriage ended in a boardroom instead of a courtroom, because that's how billionaires do things. Not even the night he stood on the roof of his own 102-story tower in Manhattan, looked down at the city he technically owned pieces of, and felt absolutely nothing. But in 6 weeks, an 81-year-old woman selling roasted maize on the side of a dirt road in Kenya was going to break him wide open. And the strange part? She wasn't even trying to. She didn't know who he was. She didn't want his money. She didn't need his pity. What she had instead was something Julian Cross didn't know existed anymore, a piece of his own past that he had spent 37 years trying to forget. And she'd been carrying it, quietly, patiently, for longer than he'd been alive as the man the world now knew. By the time this story ends, one of the richest men on the planet will be on his knees in the red dirt of a village that doesn't appear on most maps, holding something that will change the entire trajectory of his life. But to understand how he got there, we have to go back. Back before the empire. Back before the name Cross meant anything at all. Julian was born rich the way some people are born tall. It wasn't an achievement, it was just a fact of his existence. His grandfather built an oil shipping empire in the 1960s. His father doubled it. And Julian, by the time he was 34, had taken the family fortune and multiplied it 7 times over by moving into tech infrastructure, satellite internet, and most recently, global data centers. Forbes called him the coldest mind in modern business. Business Insider ran a profile titled, "The Man Who Feels Nothing." Julian never denied it. He used to joke that emotion was a design flaw, and he'd spent his whole life optimizing it out of himself. There was a reason for that. There always is. When Julian was 4 years old, his mother, Eleanor Cross, left the family's estate in Connecticut and flew to East Africa to work as a volunteer physician. She wasn't like the rest of the family. She didn't care about oil contracts or shipping lanes. She cared about the outbreak of a waterborne illness sweeping through a cluster of villages outside Nairobi, and she went to help, against her husband's wishes, against everyone's advice. She never came home. The official story Julian grew up with was simple and cold. The way everything in that house was cold, she contracted the illness she went there to treat, and she died. He was told this once, by his grandfather, in a hallway, in under 30 seconds, and then the subject was never raised again. There was no funeral he remembered attending. No grave he'd ever seen. Just an empty space in the family photographs and a silence so total it became its own kind of grief. Julian built his entire life on top of that silence. He turned it into fuel. Every acquisition, every hostile takeover, every sleepless night in a boardroom, some psychologist would probably say it was a 4-year-old boy trying to prove that if he became big enough, important enough, powerful enough, it would somehow stop hurting. It never did. It just got quieter. By the time he was 41, Julian Cross had everything a person could conceivably want, and he wanted almost none of it. He ate the same meal in the same restaurant every Tuesday because a version of himself from 15 years ago had liked it once, and no newer version had bothered to develop a different preference. He hadn't taken a vacation in 6 years that wasn't secretly a business trip. He had, by his own admission to absolutely no one, forgotten what it felt like to want something for a reason other than winning. And then his company's board approved something that would take him, for the first time in over 3 decades, back to the continent his mother died on. Cross Dynamics was expanding. Aggressively. The next frontier in data infrastructure wasn't in Silicon Valley or Singapore, it was in emerging markets, where land was cheap, labor was cheap, and governments were hungry for foreign investment. Kenya had become one of the company's top targets for a new server farm, a facility so massive it would require nearly 400 acres of land. Most of that land had already been secured. Purchased, leased, signed, sealed. Except for one stubborn parcel on the edge of a small village called Marembe, where a single landholder had refused every offer the company's negotiators put on the table. The offers weren't small. They'd started generous and gotten absurd, numbers that could rebuild an entire village 3 times over. And still, no. Normally, a deal this size wouldn't require the CEO's personal attention. Normally, Julian would let his acquisitions team handle it, apply pressure through the local government, wait it out. But something about the file irritated him in a way he couldn't quite name. A holdout who wouldn't even negotiate. No counteroffer. No demands. Just a flat, repeated no, year after year, to every company that had tried to buy that land, because apparently, Cross Dynamics wasn't the first. Who is this person? Julian asked his head of expansion, in a meeting that was supposed to last 10 minutes. An old woman, the executive said, flipping through a folder like the answer bored him. Owns about 6 acres. Grows maize, keeps some goats. Sells food by the roadside. We've offered her 40 times the market value. She won't even hear us out. Julian stared at the folder for a long moment. He didn't know why. 6 acres was nothing. Statistically meaningless to a deal this size, they could route around her land, adjust the blueprint, absorb the cost. His engineers had already prepared 3 alternate site plans. But something in him, something that had been quiet for 37 years, wanted to know why a woman with almost nothing would refuse almost everything. I'm going, Julian said. The room went silent. Going where, sir? Kenya. I want to meet her myself. His board thought it was reckless. His assistant thought it was a publicity stunt waiting to happen. The village of Marembe sat about 90 minutes outside Nairobi, past the point where the paved roads gave up and the red dirt took over completely. Julian's convoy, 3 black SUVs that looked absurdly out of place kicking up clouds of dust past goat herds and roadside fruit stands, arrived just before noon, in heat that made his tailored shirt cling to his back within minutes. He'd expected the trip to feel like every other site visit he'd ever done. Land inspection, a few photographs, polite conversation with local officials, back on the plane by evening. Instead, the first thing he saw when he stepped out of the vehicle was an old woman sitting on an overturned crate beside a small charcoal fire, turning ears of roasted maize with hands that moved like she'd done it 10,000 times before. She wore a faded orange headscarf. Her back was straight despite her age. And she didn't look up at the 3 imported SUVs the way most people did, with curiosity, or fear, or opportunity. She looked at them the way you'd look at weather. Something to wait out. That's her, his local liaison murmured. Amara. Julian approached alone. He told his security detail to stay back, which made all of them visibly uncomfortable, which he ignored, because for reasons he couldn't articulate, he didn't want an audience for this. Good afternoon, he said, in the careful, overly formal tone of a man who wasn't used to talking to people who couldn't be bought. Amara didn't answer right away. She turned another ear of maize over the coals, unhurried, like his presence hadn't rearranged anything about her afternoon. You're the one who wants my land, she finally said. Her English was accented but precise, the kind of precise that comes from someone who learned it carefully, decades ago, rather than absorbing it casually. I represent the company, yes. I know who you represent. She glanced up at him then, and Julian felt something strange happen in his chest, a flicker of a feeling he couldn't name, like his body recognized something his mind hadn't caught up to yet. You are not like the others they sent. How do you know that? Because the others sat in their cars, she said, and sent boys to talk to me. Julian almost laughed. Almost. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken to him with that particular blend of dryness and total indifference to his net worth. He sat down on the ground across from her fire, which made his security detail visibly tense from 30 feet away, and which made Amara raise an eyebrow, the first real reaction he'd gotten out of her. I'm not here to pressure you, he said. I want to understand why you've said no. To all of us. 4 years. Amara was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that Julian thought she might not answer at all. Because this is not just land, she said finally. Land you can measure. What is under it, you cannot. It was a strange, half-answer. The kind that raises more questions than it settles. Julian didn't know it yet, but that single sentence would end up being the thread that unraveled his entire understanding of his own life. He didn't push further that day. Something told him, some instinct he'd stopped trusting in boardrooms, but apparently still had somewhere underneath, that pushing would close the door completely. Instead, before he left, he noticed something. Amara's small stall was falling apart. The wooden cart she used to bring her maize to the roadside had a cracked wheel, held together with wire and hope. Her cooking fire sat exposed with no shelter, which meant every rainy season, she likely lost days of income and possibly her supplies. Julian said nothing about it in the moment. But that night, back in his Nairobi hotel suite, staring at ceiling instead of sleeping, he made a call to his logistics team that had nothing to do with the land deal at all. 3 days later, a small crew arrived in Marembe, not lawyers, not negotiators, but a construction team. They repaired Amara's cart. They built her a proper wooden stall with a corrugated roof to protect her from rain and sun. They brought a new set of cooking equipment and, at Julian's specific instruction, left no company branding anywhere. No sign. No press release. No photo op. When Amara saw it, she didn't smile the way Julian half expected. She stood very still, looking at the new stall for a long time, and then she said something to the crew that got relayed back to Julian almost word for word. "Tell him this does not buy my land." "I know," Julian said, when he heard it. That's not what it was for. But it was for something. Even he didn't fully understand what yet. He flew back to Marembe 4 days later. Told his team it was to reassess the site plan. That was a lie, and everyone in the boardroom back in New York knew it was a lie, and nobody said anything, because Julian Cross's assistant had already noticed something nobody had seen in years. Her boss had started checking his phone for weather updates in a country he had no financial reason to think about. This time, when Julian sat by Amara's fire, she offered him a piece of roasted maize before he even asked. Small gesture. Enormous shift. "You didn't have to do that," she said, meaning the stall. "I know. Powerful men don't usually give without wanting something back." "I want to understand your answer," Julian admitted. "What did you mean? What's under the land I can't measure?" Amara studied him for a long moment, the fire crackling between them, and something passed across her face that Julian couldn't read. Not suspicion, exactly. Something closer to recognition. Like she was looking for something in his features and wasn't sure yet if she'd found it. "There was a clinic here," she said slowly. "Many years ago. Small. Not much more than 2 rooms and a tin roof." "What was her name?" he asked, and his voice came out smaller than he intended. Amara looked at him, really looked at him, the way you look at someone when a suspicion that had been sitting quietly in the back of your mind for days suddenly clicks into focus. "Why does that matter to you?" she asked. And Julian, for the first time since he'd landed in this country, didn't have an answer ready. He didn't sleep that night either. He told himself it was a coincidence. Foreign doctors died doing aid work across East Africa throughout the 70s and 80s. It wasn't exactly a rare tragedy. There was no reason to assume anything. Except the timeline lined up. The region lined up. And there was a detail Amara had mentioned in passing that he couldn't shake. She'd said the doctor had a young son back home. A little boy. She remembered because the doctor used to talk about him constantly, in the evenings, while she worked, like saying his name kept her tethered to a life on the other side of the world. Julian had spent 37 years being told almost nothing about his mother's death. A hallway. 30 seconds. Silence ever since. He had never seen a grave. Never been given an urn. Never been shown so much as a photograph from her final months. He'd built an empire instead of asking why. The next morning, he went back to Marembe before his team was even awake, alone this time, against every protocol his security detail had. Amara was already at her fire. "You came back fast," she said. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth, even if it's not what I want to hear." Something shifted in Amara's expression. She set down the maize she'd been turning and gave him her full attention for the first time since they'd met. "Her name," Julian said. "The doctor. Please." Amara was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice had changed, softer, but also heavier, like she was setting down something she'd been carrying carefully for a very long time. Eleanor, she said. Dr. Eleanor Cross. The name landed like a physical blow. Julian's ears started ringing. Somewhere in the distance, he was aware of birds, of wind, of the ordinary sounds of a village morning, but all of it felt very far away, like he was hearing it through water. "That's my mother," he said. Amara didn't look surprised. That was the part that unsettled Julian most. "I know," she said quietly. "I have known since the moment you climbed out of that car. You have her eyes. I looked at you and I saw her, 40 years younger, standing in the same dirt, before she ever set foot in that clinic." "You knew," Julian said, his voice cracking in a way it hadn't cracked in decades. "This whole time, the maze, the land, the refusal to sell, you knew who I was?" "No," Amara said firmly. "I did not know your name. I did not know you were the son of the company buying my land, not until the moment I saw your face. I am an old woman who sells maize by a road. I do not read business magazines from New York." A faint, dry ghost of a smile. "But I knew your mother's face better than I know my own children's, because I held her hand while she died, and I promised her something I have kept for 37 years. Julian's knees genuinely felt unsteady. He lowered himself onto the crate across from her, all pretense of composure gone. "What did you promise her?" Amara reached into the folds of her wrap and pulled out something small, wrapped in a piece of cloth so worn and handled it had gone soft as fabric. She held it for a moment before she passed it across the fire to him. "That I would keep this safe," she said. "Until her son came looking for the truth. She told me he would, one day. She said he was stubborn, like his grandfather, and that stubbornness would either destroy him or save him, depending on what he did with it. She made me promise not to seek him out. She said if he was meant to find it, he would find it himself." Julian unwrapped the cloth with hands that weren't entirely steady. Inside was a photograph, faded nearly to sepia, of a young woman in a white coat standing outside a tin-roofed building, laughing at something outside the frame, holding a small boy on her hip who couldn't have been older than 3. Underneath the photograph was a folded letter, the paper gone soft and brittle with age, sealed with wax that had cracked but never broken. On the front, in handwriting Julian hadn't seen in 37 years but recognized instantly, in the deepest, oldest part of himself, were 4 words. "For my son, Julian." He didn't open it right away. He couldn't. His hands were shaking too hard, and some part of him, the part that had spent 3 decades building emotional walls so thick even he'd forgotten what was behind them, needed a moment before he let this final piece fall into place. "Why didn't you sell the land?" he finally managed to ask, "in all these years? You could have taken the money. Moved somewhere easier. Lived comfortably for the rest of your life." Amara looked at him like the answer should have been obvious. "Because the ground holds her," she said simply. "And I promised. Money does not outweigh a promise made to a dying woman who trusted me with her son's future when she could not be there to give it to him herself." Julian looked down at the letter in his hands. Then at the woman across the fire, a woman who had turned down life-changing wealth, year after year, from company after company, not out of stubbornness or negotiation strategy, but because she had made a promise to a stranger 4 decades ago and had simply, quietly, refused to break it. He thought about every no his team had reported back to him with irritation. Every meeting where they'd called her unreasonable, difficult, an obstacle to route around. And the entire time, she had been the last living guardian of the one piece of his history his own family had erased. "I have to ask, Julie." "There was an outbreak," she said. "Waterborne sickness, spreading fast through 3 villages. She worked 18, 19 hours some days. She would not stop, even when we begged her to rest. She said if she stopped, people would die who did not have to. On the 9th week, she caught the sickness herself." Amara paused, and for the first time, her composure cracked slightly. "She knew before any of us. She told me, quietly, one evening, and made me promise to say nothing until it was over, so no one would waste medicine on her that a child might need more." Julian's throat had closed completely. He couldn't speak. "She died 4 days later," Amara continued, "in my arms, in the clinic she refused to leave. Her last words were about you. She said she hoped you would grow up soft in a hard world, not hard in a soft one. She was afraid, I think, of what kind of man you might become without her. Julian sat in the dirt of a village he hadn't known existed a month earlier, holding a letter from a mother he'd spent 37 years believing had simply, coldly, disappeared from his life, and understood, all at once, exactly what kind of man he had become. Hard. In a soft world. Precisely what she'd feared. He finally broke the wax seal. The letter was short. Eleanor had known she was dying when she wrote it, there hadn't been time or strength for anything long. But every line landed like it had been aimed directly at the exact moment Julian was living in, 37 years later. She wrote that she wasn't sorry for coming. That the version of dying with purpose felt different, lighter, somehow, than the alternative of a long, safe life spent doing nothing that mattered. She wrote that she hoped, more than anything, that Julian would grow up understanding that the family fortune wasn't the same thing as a meaningful life, and that if he ever found himself confusing the two, she hoped something, or someone, would find a way to remind him. She wrote that she loved him more than the family's entire net worth combined, and that if this letter ever reached him, it meant he'd finally come looking for the truth instead of accepting the silence he'd probably been raised inside of. She was right about that last part. She'd been right about almost everything. Julian sat by that fire for nearly 2 hours, reading the letter over and over, while Amara quietly tended the coals and said nothing, giving him the kind of space that only someone who had once held his dying mother's hand would know how to give. When he finally looked up, his face wet in a way it hadn't been in front of another person in his entire adult life, he asked the question that had been building underneath everything else. Why didn't you ever try to find me? You knew my name. You could have reached out. Told me all of this decades ago. Amara's answer was simple, and it hit harder than anything else she'd said. Because grief you go looking for isn't the same as grief that finds you, she said. Your mother believed the truth should come to you when you were ready to carry it, not before. I have watched many powerful men come through this village over the years, chasing land, chasing profit, never once asking what came before them. I was waiting, she said, to see if you would be different. And you were. You asked about a grave before you asked about a deed. Julian didn't fly back to New York that week. He didn't fly back the week after either. He canceled 3 board meetings, which sent his executive team into a genuine panic, and spent 9 days in Marembe instead, not negotiating, not inspecting, not doing any of the things a billionaire is supposed to do on a business trip. He spent it finding his mother's grave, tucked behind what remained of the old clinic's foundation, overgrown with grass that Amara had apparently been quietly clearing by hand for 37 years because no one had ever asked her to stop. He knelt in that overgrown patch of earth for a long time. Long enough that his security team, watching from a respectful distance, eventually just sat down in the dirt themselves rather than hover. When he stood back up, Julian Cross was, by every measurable metric, still the same man. Same net worth. Same company. Same face the world recognized from magazine covers. But something fundamental underneath all of it had shifted, the way a foundation shifts after an earthquake, invisible from the outside, but structurally, permanently different. He called his board that evening and told them the data center project was being redesigned. Not cancelled, Cross Dynamics still needed the infrastructure, and the region still needed the investment and the jobs it would bring. But the site plan would be redrawn around Amara's land, not through it. Her 6 acres would remain hers, untouched, for as long as she lived, and afterward, by the terms Julian personally drafted, they would become a protected memorial site, his mother's grave marked properly for the first time in nearly 4 decades, the old clinic's foundation preserved rather than paved over. He also did something his legal team initially resisted and then, once they understood the full story, stopped resisting entirely. He established a fund in his mother's name, not a plaque, not a press release moment, but a genuine, ongoing medical fund for the villages in that region, staffed with the kind of resources Eleanor Cross had never had access to when she was working 18-hour days trying to stop an outbreak with almost nothing. Amara was asked to help decide how the fund's resources were used. She said yes, on one condition, that it never carry the Cross Dynamics logo, that it never be used for a photo op, and that nobody ever forget it started because an old woman refused to sell 6 acres of land to men who only ever asked her what her price was, and never once asked her why she'd said no. Here's the part most people who hear this story afterward find hardest to believe. Julian Cross didn't become a different person overnight. He didn't quit his company, give away his fortune in some dramatic public gesture, or disappear into a simpler life the way these stories sometimes go in the version people wish were true. What actually changed was smaller, and in some ways, far more permanent. He started calling his own children, two teenagers from his failed marriage who he'd essentially outsourced to nannies and boarding schools for most of their lives, every single day, not to check in about their schedules, but to actually ask them how they were. He started showing up. Not perfectly. Not every time. But consistently, in a way he never had before. He kept a framed copy of that photograph on his desk in the New York office, his mother, laughing, holding a toddler version of himself outside a clinic that no longer existed. Every executive who walked into that office for the next decade saw it and, eventually, most of them stopped asking who it was, because the story had traveled through the company on its own, quietly, the way meaningful things tend to. And every year, on the anniversary of his mother's death, a date he hadn't even known until Amara told him, Julian flew back to Marembe. Not for business. Not for press. Just to sit by a small grave with proper markings now, next to a woman who had kept a promise for longer than most people keep anything, and to remember that the richest thing he'd ever been handed in his entire life wasn't a company, or a fortune, or an empire built out of grief he never let himself examine. It was a folded letter, wrapped in worn cloth, held safe by a stranger who owed him absolutely nothing, and gave him everything anyway. Amara passed away 4 years later, peacefully, in her sleep, in a home Julian had quietly built for her on the same land she'd refused to sell, because in the end, she never had to sell it. It became hers permanently, protected, exactly as she'd wanted from the very beginning. Julian gave the eulogy himself. He didn't mention cross dynamics once. He talked instead about a woman who'd spent nearly 4 decades keeping a promise to someone she'd never expected to see again, simply because a promise, once made, was worth more to her than any number that could be offered against it. At the end, he said something that the villagers who were there still repeat, years later, whenever someone new hears the story for the first time. My mother once wrote that she hoped I'd grow up soft in a hard world, instead of hard in a soft one. For 37 years, I got that backwards. It took an old woman selling maize on the side of a dirt road to finally set it right. He closed the eulogy the way Amara herself might have, simply, and without needing anything else added to it. Some of the wealthiest people in the world are never the ones on any list. Some of them are just sitting quietly by a fire, keeping a promise nobody asked them to keep, waiting for the right person to finally come and ask why. If this story moved you, remember this: the smallest, quietest acts of loyalty and kindness are very often the ones that end up changing everything. Not because they were designed to, but because someone, somewhere, was patient enough to wait for the right moment to matter.